Welcome to a new episode of NextGen Ninja. I'm your host, Kory Farooquie. On this show, I have the pleasure of interviewing those entrepreneurial and enterprise leaders that are defining what the world looks like for coming generations. Today, we have an amazing guest. He is Steve Hill. He's a global head of innovation for KPMG, one of the largest and leading tax audit and advisory firms in the world. He's a leading authority on the what's next. He has an illustrious career that has spanned firms like McKinsey, Bearing Point, and he is today leading a innovative aspect of KPMG. I'm also humbled to call Steve one of my mentors. And so, Steve, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Kory. Thank you for the kind words.
No, I think we can probably just go through the entire show with listing your accomplishments.
No, that would be boring.
So, Steve, as the global head of innovation for KPMG, a multi-billion-dollar advisory firm that impacts global enterprises and their customers, can you explain to our viewers and our listeners how you came into your role?
To sum it up very simply, I would say I came into it by accident. Which is a little bit of jest, but the reality is it was an evolution. Right? It started with my role as head of services for advisory. So advisory is what we call consulting, and we have three functions inside of KPMG: a tax function, an audit function, and an advisory function, which is consulting. We work across our functional lines as clients need and across our global footprint. But the reality is I had a leadership role within the consulting group of KPMG. And I was head of services. And what that meant was, was the service portfolio healthy? What was the market telling our firm? Were the services becoming antiquated or less relevant over time? And, did we need to create new services in addition to what we had? Did we need to evolve the services that we had to be something different than they were, right? And did we need to sunset services? Because a lot of times, for example, SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley services, they had a shelf life, and so you don't run them forever, and you sunset them when it makes sense based on the market conditions. And so, interestingly enough, my role in innovation started with a role as head of services. And as I started to work with others and to expand the aperture, if you will, of who was involved in managing this portfolio of services, it became apparent that what I was really doing was what today we'll call, in many ways, innovation. Although, between you and I, frankly, I'm not a big fan of the word innovation. I think it's a buzzword for a lot of people, and in fact, I think in some ways, innovation has been hijacked by a lot of marketing departments to provide some sort of aura of value attribution to something that is new, whether it was innovative, right, or not necessarily. But it does provide a context for value, and I think today, when you look at the capital markets and you look at companies that are leading the capital markets in many ways, most of those companies, most of those brands are considered innovative. And so there is a value attributable to it, but innovation just isn't about marketing. It's really about taking ideas and turning them into cash. And so as my role evolved, the idea of taking, market, signals and turning them into so what's for our business, and then translating those so what's into investments, building things, buying things, teaming with third parties on different services for our clients, and then evaluating how those services were performing over time became part of what we today now call innovation. So for KPMG, it's not a buzzword. It's really pragmatic, and I think it's a global process. It's part of our culture today because everybody has to be a part of it. So it's actually gotten much more mature. But it has been an evolution over probably 13, 14 years.
And 13, 14 years seems like no time at all.
Right.
So, we really are in a pivotal moment these days with a lot of new technologies, a lot of new innovations. And I know along with innovations, there are some few other buzzwords that you don't like. Disruption may be one. I know that you don't like to be called a futurist.
That's true.
I consider you one. But what I will say is, you really keep your ear on the ground, and you understand the pulse of what's next, and then guide this giant ship, KPMG, into ensuring that you stay ahead of the curve. Not just ahead of the curve, but as an influencer, influencing your clients to ensure that they also stay ahead of the curve. Mm-hmm. So, with that said, it's a good segue into some of the hype around the disruptive technologies today. So you can innovate with an eye on the ball on disruptive technologies, but today, unlike maybe the last few years, we've got a bunch of different disruptive technologies happening, and so they're coming into the market space and into the buzzwords or ears of everybody, that they almost have a shelf life that makes them a fad of the year. How do you think enterprise leaders should respond to disruptions in their industries, disruptive technologies around them, and especially when you think of large enterprises, do you think that the leadership is ready to kind of change course and continue to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, that's a pretty big question, right? And I think that there are several facets of the answer that I'll highlight, right, for brevity. The first one is, I think there's a pretty wide acknowledgement today that, corporate culture and corporate governance evolves over time. I mean, when you think about the first real amalgamations of a global corporate enterprise, it was the East India Trading Company.
Right.
And, accounting was, matured in that context, right? And then you had Industrial Revolution. You had a lot of things that have matured the way we govern companies, including leadership, right? We used to have chief electricity officers back when, electricity was nascent. We had chief power officers that looked at getting the factory located near the right river for a wheel to turn to power belts, so that you had force to drive machines. I mean, all these roles were created because of technologies. Steam was a disruption for the maritime industry, for example, right?
100%, and that's perfect, because today, up till now, we've kind of managed it. We've had organizations, especially large organizations, that have chief information officers, the CIO role,
right,
or the CTO role, that kind of manage the technology implementation within their organizations and how it impacts their clients.
Right.
But what we're seeing today is a new breed of leadership that is the chief innovator or the chief innovation officer.
Yep.
And it's and I've been talking about it for a while, that there should be a chief disruption officer or a chief innovation officer, because you really need someone to kind of understand what blockchain means to my business in my industry,
right,
or what AI means to my business in my industry outside of the hype. So because that change is so rapid, because leadership has little time to react before the next thing comes around, and organizations are creating these chief innovation officer roles, what advice would you give these chief innovation officers that are listening to kind of look at these technologies and understand how it impacts them?
So, I mean, I think the chief innovation officer gets to my point around governance, right? I mean, first of all, I would say companies need to think about the muscle that they have inside of their governance to change the status quo, not just operate the status quo. Most of the companies that exist that are incumbents today operate pretty darn well, and they've had many, many years, of practice. But they haven't had a lot of years in changing the status quo systematically. Disruptions have happened in the past, and they've responded to them, but it was more of an episodic kind of reaction as opposed to a premeditated, calculated strategy. chief innovators need to understand that innovation isn't just about process and about technology, right? It's also about culture, and it's about driving, I think, something extremely important, a clock speed change. There's a clock speed dilemma today, I think, with incumbents that is very powerful. And if you think about that for a second, startups, especially digital native startups, move at a very rapid pace.
And when you refer to incumbents, you're talking about current large legacy organizations,
large corporates,
that,
large, multi-billion-dollar organizations, there's a clock speed that you have in terms of how you manage your company. Most companies budget annually, et cetera. They have cycles for things. The reality is, you need to start to question those clock speeds that you have. I think that there is a greater need to question the status quo inside of an organization than once a year having a strategy conversation at the board, and that's rare, or even at the management team table. I think strategy has to be much more systematic as a conversation point. The chief innovation officer, or whatever you call that person or group of people managing that corporate muscle and governance to question the status quo, that needs to be systematic, and it needs to be part of how you think about building the sustainability of your organization over time. How do you future-proof your growth? If you don't, focus enough on questioning the status quo, you are likely to be disintermediated or disrupted by a third party. And again, these digital startups are unbundling, if you will, a lot of incumbent organizations, whether it's shipping goods or whether it's banks or whether it's the accounting industry. We're not immune from any of the things that I'm talking about. In fact, I spent a lot of time inside of KPMG helping our own firm understand how to mature its business, and not just the business services, but the models of business, how we actually relate to customers. These are all things that are being changed by those technologies you referred to earlier. And there's no silver bullet, right? So it's not a blockchain answer, it's not an AI answer, it's not a cloud answer.
It's an attitude.
It's a portfolio answer, right? And so you have to put those things into business context. What's the so what of blockchain to your business? Right. If you're a bank, it's pretty clear, right, that blockchain has an impact. And what are those impacts? And how do you go from being a recipient of that disruption to a creator of that disruption?
Exactly.
How do you, strategically position yourself so that you're on firm ground, feeling confident about your ability to serve a new channel or a new set of customers that are emerging from demographic changes that are occurring today? That's what a chief innovation officer needs to start to think through.
So, there's a great quote, which is, even if you're on the right path and you quit moving, you're going to get run over. So we've got plenty of examples in industry, in the annals of those enterprises that were market leaders at one point, failed to innovate or failed to understand what disruption was around them, and today they're the BlackBerries or the Kodaks or the Blockbusters of the world, or the Toys R Us. And so, what I'd like to do is, on the guests on this show are chief innovation officers, your futurists, those that are bending those rules and breaking those rules. But a lot of times, you're a large enterprise, and you're looking at this large enterprise and saying, I got processes and I got a budget that I started this year that's already for next year. So for those large enterprises and those enterprise leaders, where do they start? Where do they start looking at innovation and impacting their internal? How do they stay relevant? Is automation and RPA, intelligent automation, is that a step one? If not, what is the step one?
So first of all, I think acknowledging the fact, and by the way, let's just not assume that every large enterprise has a chief innovation officer or even a formalized innovation capability established. So, and by the way, board members are asking these same questions. I talk to a lot of board members, and in the circles of those discussions, I hear a lot of noise around, hey, how do we know if our management teams are investing in the right things? How do we know that our organization is going to be relevant in the near term. And when I say near term, I'm talking about 3 to 5 years,
Right.
not 50 years. And those are legitimate questions. I think so. Management teams need to respond to that proactively to say, let's put some muscle in place that questions the status quo. A. B. Once they start to realize that they need to have that in place, they start putting in place. You get a leader who's respected in the business in that role. Much better generally than going outside and finding somebody who's a futurist, for example. I mean, you have to keep innovation pragmatic, meaning it has to prove value as it scales in the organization. You can't build innovation from a today point to a we're building for 10 years. It's too far. People won't have the confidence. They'll be too fearful of the change. So I think you have to have somebody who's trusted in the business start to make the change happen, and you work incrementally, right? It's a maturation, but a framework that I share with a lot of clients and other folks in the industry that look at innovation. One of the frameworks I share that is helpful in how you start is looking at your business in what I would call the 21st century enterprise framework, which are 4 pillars underlying a bunch of these technologies. So all these technologies are enabling change in these 4 pillars. And the 4 pillars are as follows. The first is your customers. Take a look at your customer relationships and your customer experience. How is that evolving, right? On the other end of the bookend of these pillars is your workforce. How will your workforce evolve? There is no question in anybody's mind today that technology and AI in particular is changing the dynamic of how humans and machines work with each other. And so those 2 pillars that are people-centric, which are super important to get right relative to culture and leadership, are 2 of the 4 pillars. The other pillar, which is interesting in many cases, is the pillar that's associated with how you value assets in the enterprise. 10 years ago, if you looked at the top 5 market caps in the U.S., they were all companies that created value generally from tangible assets, plant, machine, etc. Today, the top 5 companies are all companies that generate their value from intangible assets.
Right.
Okay? There's a shift happening, and what that means is the things that you used to value are shifting. There's a term in the marketplace today that you're going to be Amazon, right? What Jeff Bezos has done has proven to the world that data can disrupt industries, and that insight, that knowledge that data brings is powerful. And data as an asset is one of the things that I think companies need to think about and evaluate. And many strategies for the future need to center on data, not on maybe traditional items of value going forward. The last pillar I'll talk about is as a service. The way that you scale and rationalize your capabilities as an organization today is much more dynamic than it used to be. And there's a large industry, by the way, growing around AI as a service. So as technology has evolved, it's provided platforms for you to scale up and scale down and scale in geographies and scale with different channels, leveraging as a service models for growth. That allows you agility, right? And a lot of big companies aren't used to that. Right? Small companies do it because that's what they have to do to grow quickly. Right?
That and small companies are or startups are starting from a point where they're aware of these technologies, so they can start off as a data-driven organization and even grow as large as Amazon and continue to be that data-driven organization. Right. For large enterprises, they may collect a ton of data. They may not even know where it is or what they're collecting, or if they're collecting the right thing, or how to leverage it.
Exactly.
So, in some sense, small, nimble disruptors or startups are at an advantage. And in other aspects, the large enterprises are. But from a innovation perspective, one of the key things maybe that I would say is that if you're going to do something and have somebody that's your chief innovation officer, or really quarterbacking and looking outside and being the lighthouse, you need to empower them in order to know and make those decisions, right? So what would you say, going back to that question, between a large enterprise and you are, heading innovation for a giant enterprise that impacts giants across the world. Are large enterprises at an advantage today or a disadvantage in terms of their ability to look at different things and have them impact them in a positive way?
Yeah, I think so it's an interesting question. So I think, and by the way, we serve both large organizations and small in our
Sure.
total client set. What I would characterize as an advantage of a large organization is, one, they have capital, and they have, and by the way, that's dollars, and it's also people. It's a lot of experience and knowledge and relationships that, startups don't have access to, and channel, right? Those are great. Those are on the sort of on the positive side. On the negative side, or the potentially negative side for large corporates, this clock speed dilemma that I talked about before is a prominent feature of a potential impediment, right? The fact that they are so large, that they have so many people and whatnot, causes them, especially if they're a very collaborative culture and whatnot, it causes them to move more slowly than a garage operation can move, right?
And also, I would say, I had a great discussion with Salim Ismail on the first episode a couple weeks ago, and he brings this point that I love, which is, if you bring something new into an organization, the immune system of that organization attacks it, and how large enterprises, the incumbents, the legacy organizations, how they can be innovative in different ways. So it's really important to focus on it, but it's also very important to understand what your internal culture is.
Absolutely. And in fact, again, I think culture can be an asset or it can be an impediment, right? And at the end of the day, because most corporate governance machines, if you will, are about operating with excellence, it is natural that the white blood cells of that operation will attack the new thing.
Sure.
Because by definition, it's encumbering on operating excellence of the status quo, right? So you have to balance, and which is why innovation isn't a big bang necessarily. You start in a place that is protected, to your point. And by the way, a lot of companies today are experimenting with venture arms and whatnot, so that they can seed innovative companies that, in some ways, even cannibalize the status quo. But they want to control the narrative on that, and they should, right? So there are different models that you can leverage to build innovative capabilities that are protected from the antibodies of the status quo. But again, I think from a large company standpoint, the clock speed is an issue. I think that culture, if you're not open for change, if your culture is not change ready, which is, again, I think a maturation of, you see chief culture officers in many organizations today.
Right.
That is about how do you get your workforce ready for the agility you need in the future. And so there's some advantages and there's disadvantages, right? And the small companies, to answer your question, the small caps don't have all the money, right? They don't have the scale and the talent, but what they do have is the agility. They do have access as a service to growing capabilities much faster than the incumbents they're fighting did when they used to have to build it within the four walls.
But the incumbents have the ability to look at those and keep an eye on what's coming as a startup in their industry.
If they can see it. And again, this is why the chief innovation officer is important, because if you're not looking for it, it's too late oftentimes. And frankly, with the speed of digital in particular, right? When you notice it, when you feel the pain in a large corporate, generally it's too late to do much about it.
Sure.
Ask banks about how all the fintechs have been, and how that industry has been unbundled, right? It's amazing that there is so much activity going on today in the fintech space.
So we're running short on time. I got a lot to cover, and we only have a few minutes left. Just to wrap this point up real quick, the sense of urgency. Mm-hmm. Can large enterprises look at things like, hey, let's upgrade our ERP or some other system or or do they really need to focus on this because this change is unlike any we've seen before. So from an urgency perspective, where do you see the urgency?
Yeah, so I mean, look, first off, to be really brief, you need a roadmap for change. You can't ignore the things that are operating the status quo because you have to continue to appease stakeholders, whether they're shareholders or leadership or partners or whatever it is. At the end of the day, you can't do it blindly. And you have to understand that pretty significant change is part of everyone's future. And so a digital roadmap is what you want to build. And a chief innovation officer can help the management team build it. It should not be black box to a chief innovation officer. There's not near enough sensitivity to the status quo of the chief innovation officer to do that well.
Sure.
So it has to be a collective exercise. It needs to be centered on data, right, and other intangibles, along with the assets that are traditional assets, the tangible assets. And there should be a migration in that roadmap of how do you wean yourself from things that you know have a shelf life that is going away.
Got it.
Right, and the issue here is again, clock speed is part of the dynamic, but speed. Most of the change that we experience looks like it's linear until you realize it's not.
Sure.
And the exponential changes that are occurring are significant. We typically overestimate, which gets to your sort of technology of the year or of the
fad,
week.
yeah.
Right. We overestimate sometimes the impact of some of these technologies in the near term, and we typically underestimate the impact of those technologies in the longer term.
So stay anchored, but keep your eye forward and not backward.
Yes, that's right. And
Okay.
and you know what? Be bold.
Be bold.
Be brave enough to understand that you're going to change, and change doesn't have to be fearful.
So that right there, that's exactly where I want to go from. So one is be bold, be brave, and empower those leaders that you've brought in to look at innovation, to keep your company alive and relevant,
Yeah.
and really let them make those decisions. I want to switch gears real quick as we wrap up. I want to highlight something that a lot of the viewers that and listeners that are listening to the show that know KPMG and know you, they may not know this, but you have another life. I live vicariously through this life of yours. So, Steve, you are an international GT race car driver and a winner of 3 consecutive championships. To me, I don't even know what you do on the weekends other than splitting atoms or what it is, but how do you find the time? Because a lot of people will say, I don't have time, I'm too busy. And kind of tying this into the topic of the show, the NextGen ninjas, the next generation, how important is it for humans to follow our passions outside of work? The generation that's growing up today, my kids, the AI natives, their experience of life is very limited to screens. And even as parents, I make a concerted effort to try to get them outside of that. But I give in sometimes. So, how important is it for us to look at life and balance that work-life balance and be a race car driver, for instance?
Yeah, well, the way that I would sum it up is to say you have to enjoy what you do. I really enjoy working in what people will refer to as innovation. I mean, I enjoy, making an impact and making a difference, changing the status quo. I also enjoy racing cars, and unlike a lot of common perceptions about the sport, it's actually extremely technical. It takes an incredible amount of practice and skill. But more importantly, it provides a lot of synergy with what I do on the innovation side. Because of the technical nature of the sport, because it's so intense, it doesn't allow me to be distracted, right, with work while I'm racing. And I need a mental palate cleaner sometimes to be fresh and recharged
I
on
love
Monday.
that, mental palate cleaner.
Yeah. I mean, you need a high-intensity activity sometimes to offset a high-intensity job.
Sure.
I balance those things. And in fact, I find that some of the analogies in the sport apply to the business and vice versa. So it's very synergistic, interestingly enough.
And just for everybody's information, if you want to follow Steve in the racing tour, how do I do that?
Hill Motorsports at Facebook or Instagram, and you get to the page.
That's awesome. All right. So last couple of notes. We're going to wrap up. I like to get my guests to touch on 2 points. One is identify leaders in the enterprise world and the entrepreneurial world that are looking outside and looking at the future as those that are, and defining the world for future generations as NextGen ninjas, and that's what the show is about. What does it take, in your opinion, to be a NextGen ninja? And give us a little bit of advice on how to be that person.
Well, I don't know about a ninja, but I mean, I think what it takes is being insecure with the status quo. I think you have, and having a very strong desire to make an impact, right? And in some ways to be
passionate
very,
about it.
and to be a little bit selfless about it. I know that may sound a little ironic because some leaders in the space may appear the opposite, but the reality is, questioning the status quo means you question what you think too,
and working yourself out of a job, not be a
well,
self-president.
you work yourself out of a current position, right? For sure. And I think that that insecurity with the status quo is a little bit more motivating than the greed side of this discussion might become, which is if you want to take advantage of something, you got to think differently. Well, that's fine, but I think that the fear of not getting it right is it wakes you up in the morning with just a hair more energy than a greed narrative would.
So your view of the future, 5, 10 years, 15 years from now, drones flying everywhere, driverless cars.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of phenomena that we're going to see. The hockey stick of the exponential growth on. Autonomous vehicles is one area where I think mobility as a service is going to change the way we get around.
Right.
And I have lots of friends in the automotive industry. My family's involved in the industry, and we've talked about how things are going to change. It's fascinating how things are going to change. But if you took a picture of New York City in 1907, you saw you'd see 2 cars on the streets. If you took a picture just 5 years later in 1912, you'd see none. The horses were gone, right? I mean, none. You'd see none, as in the horses,
right?
Because horse manure and their waste was such a problem. The adoption of cars in New York City was the most probably visible, right, amalgamation of that phenomenon taking hold. But that was back in the early 20th century. We're in the 21st century today, and these technologies are moving much faster, right? Think of Moore's Law and all these other things. So I think we're going to see an incredible world in 10 years and 5 years. I think, that a lot of people that say if you live to 2023, you're going to live to 100 years old on average, probably right.
Yeah.
I mean, because all this technology is coming into the medical arena, it's coming into how we move, it comes into how productive we are.
And time is going so fast, right? 2020 is 6 months away.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
Right.
In 2005, people in the automotive industry would say driverless cars are at least 50 years away.
No chance. No chance.
And here we are in 2019,
right.
and Pizza Hut and Domino's are about to release driverless
I think
pizza deliveries.
In 10 years, we're going to see, and it's going to happen very asynchronously.
Sure.
I like to say that the future is already here. It's just not very well distributed. You're seeing this happen in a lot of places, and the cities are going to go first because autonomous vehicles have, on average, a 30% reduction of infrastructure load than driver scenarios. So that's massive budget for most major cities. Once you start to change that dynamic, the insurance companies are going to have to, offer premiums differently for those who want to drive because the actuarial data is going to change dramatically, right? And so you just start to see this snowball of how things are going to affect. And what you need, going back to the point of this discussion, is somebody who thinks through the cause and effects.
Sounds great.
What are those correlations, right?
So, Steve, we've run out of time. I just want to give you the any kind of closing remarks you may have for our viewers and our listeners for the show.
Well, I think it's great that you're highlighting new thinking and how we govern our businesses and how we govern our lives. So thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the dialogue.
Now, Steve, it's been great. It's been a great discussion. Love to have you back at some point as well. And thank you so much for taking the time today.
You bet. My pleasure.
It's been a great discussion with Steve Hill today. If you want to learn more, you can go to our website, www.nextgen.ninja, learn about Steve, learn about the upcoming guests. Next week, I'm going to have Paul Puopolo, who is the Chief Innovation Officer for the DFW Airport. Paul's going to be talking about, what does the future of the travel industry and airport look like. The DFW Airport is the 4th busiest airport in the world. It's as big as Manhattan. So it almost looks like what a synopsis of a smart city may look like. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Again, the website is nextgen.ninja. Join the mailing list. Subscribe on Facebook, LinkedIn, on the YouTube channel, and listen to the show on all of your favorite podcast streaming services. Lastly, Salim Ismail's autographed book, Exponential Transformation. We're still trying to get the subscribers up, and hopefully in a short time, we're going to pick one of the subscribers and send that autographed book to them. All right. My name is Kory Farooquie. I'm your host for NextGen Ninja, and stay future focused.